Hi, this is Nancy Newell in Sister Campbell's CIT230 class talking about CSS specificity, or in other words, how to get your CSS to do what you want. The different weights of selectors is usually the reason why your CSS rules don't apply to some elements even when you think they should. In order to minimize the time you spend debugging, you need to understand how browsers interpret your code. Specificity, some say, is one of the hardest concepts to master in CSS. So what is specificity? When two or more CSS rules apply to the same element, specificity is how the browser determines which one wins, which one trumps the other and gets displayed. Every selector has its place in the specificity hierarchy. There are 4 distinct categories which define the specificity level of a given selector. Inline styles are present in your HTML document. It's attached directly to the element that's being styled, such as here we have a heading 1 styled directly in the HTML. The second is an ID. ID is an identifier for your page elements, such as here we have an output div. The third are classes, attributes, and pseudo-classes. This group we have a class, the dot class, we have an attribute, and the hover is a pseudo-class. For instance, if you wanted to style your link, but only when the mouse is hovering over it, you would use the hover pseudo-class. The fourth is elements and pseudo-elements, including before or after, as well as regular elements like an unordered list. If you don't know what exactly any of these terms stand for, there are some great resources at the end of the presentation that will be given to you. So here we have an example. We have some CSS rules that apply to the HTML on the right. We have 2 different rules that are trying to apply different colors to this HTML. So the question is, which one will win? We have a class in one and an element and ID in the other. There's only one rule for font size, so no matter the hierarchy of the rest of the rules, the font size is going to be 12 pixels. For the rest, there aren't exactly conflicts, but the browser does need a way to determine which one to display. This is where the specificity rules come in. A good way to write this rule would be like this, including the immediately applicable elements and the ID. Now you could be even more specific like this, but that's going a bit overboard. As we saw, the ID outweighed the class. CSS applies vastly different specificity weights to classes and IDs. In fact, according to CSStricks.com, an ID has infinitely more specificity value. That is, no amount of classes alone can outweigh an ID. Similarly, no amount of elements can outweigh a class. If the element has any inline styling, then it's basically going to win. It's going to have a specificity value of 1000. You could consider it like 1,000 points. For each ID value, you're going to apply 0100, or like 100 points. Each class value or pseudo-class or attribute selector is going to have basically 10 points. And every element reference apply 1 point. Here we can practice calculating some CSS specificities values. Our first example has an element, body, and then an ID, content, a class, data, another element, image, and a pseudo-class, hover. So starting at 0, we would add 1,000 for any style attributes. There are none here, so we'll put a 0 there. Next, we add 100 for each ID. There is 1. Then we're going to add 10 for each attribute. In this case, there are 2. We have 2 classes, data, and the pseudo-class, hover. And then we have 1 for each element name, body, and image. So this particular CSS has a specificity of 0122, or basically 122. Doing another one, this time we are going to add the style attribute, which would be 0. We have one ID, one class or attribute, and 2 elements. You can generally read the values as if they were a number, like 1,000, or in this case 112, and so on. So 1,000 clearly wins over 100. But the commas are there to remind us that this really is not a base 10 system, because you could technically have a specificity value like 0, 1, 13, 4, and that 13 is not going to spill over like a base 10 system would. Now, what if you have 2 rules with the exact same specificity? In this case, last is the best of all the game, because the last rule is going to win. Next, let's talk about links. We use pseudoclasses often to change how a link looks when we hover over it or visit it. So how does that work with specificity? All of the pseudoclasses have equal weight, as it turns out. And so the styles all have the same specificity. So this is where LVHA comes in. Link, visited, hover, and active. Each of these pseudoclasses have the same specificity. And so when all of them apply to a hyperlink, and in some cases more than one will apply at the same time. For example, an unvisited link can be hovered and active at the same time as it's unvisited. Since 3 of the above rules apply to the hyperlink and the selectors all have the same specificity, then the last one listed will win. Therefore, the active style, if listed like this, will never appear because it will always be overridden by hover. Now, consider a hyperlink which has been visited. It will always and forever be purple because its visited style beats out any other state, including active and hover, because it's the last listed. This is why it is recommended that your list goes like this: link, visited, hover, active. The first 2 could be done in either order because the link cannot be both visited and unvisited at the same time. You can also chain pseudoclasses together like this. Now, we have some exceptions to the rules. The universal selector, combinators, and the negation pseudoclass. They have no effect on specificity. However, the selectors declared inside the negation pseudoclass do have specificity. Inline styles added to an element will always overwrite any styles in an external style sheet, and thus can be thought of as having the highest specificity. Now, there is an important declaration that overrides any others, and although technically important has nothing to do with specificity, it interacts directly with it. Using important, however, is considered bad practice, and it should be avoided because it makes debugging more difficult because it breaks the natural cascading in your style sheets. When 2 conflicting rules with the important rule are applied to the same element, then the declaration with the greater specificity will be applied. You should always look for ways to use specificity before even considering important. Only use important on page-specific CSS that overrides foreign CSS from external libraries like Bootstrap or normalize.css. You should never use important on site-wide CSS. Instead of using important, consider making better use of your CSS cascading properties. Use more specific rules. By indicating one or more element before the element you're selecting, the rule becomes more specific and it gets higher priority. And you can duplicate simple selectors to increase the specificity when you have nothing more to specify. Styles for a directly targeted element will always take precedence over inherited styles, regardless of the specificity of the inherited rule. This CSS, for example, applied to this HTML on the right, will apply purple to H1, an element, even though the green rule is targeting an ID with a higher specificity, because it's targeting the H1 directly. Last, here are those promised resources. These are the websites that I use to compile the information presented to you today. I really hope you find them useful. Thank you so much.